Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly break down how Mikel Arteta won the tactical battle over Solskjaer to claim his first victory as Arsenal manager. But before we do that, don't forget to give our video a thumbs up if you do enjoy it. The bell below does give you daily notifications regarding our organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel on our road to 3K subscribers. But when we do look at the board, it's 4-2-3-1 against 4-2-3-1. And the big risk here is that both sides could cancel each other out. But when we do assess the game and break it down, there was a clear pathway to goal, and it was down that left-hand side where we had Daniel James against Kolasinac. We saw Wan-Bissaka against Aubameyang, but for the most part, Granit Xhaka also played a key role there. When we look to see how both sides look to approach the game first, it was very simple. With Arsenal, what we ended up seeing them do was they continued with that 4-4-2 without the ball, dropping off deeper. You had Aubameyang and you had Nicolas Pepe stepping too close down the fullbacks. When they didn't, they dropped off and retreated into their shape. And what was key here with Arsenal was they had Lacazette ahead of Lindelof stepping towards him, and Ozil was supposed to be ahead of Matic. The big issue that Arsenal had in this scenario was based off the fact that if we did see Lacazette shift over two-step to Maguire, then that would leave space free for Lindelof to push forward. When that did happen, there was a time where we did see Aubameyang shift over, but for the most part, we did have Lacazette sitting on top of Lindelof, and then he could block off the passing lane into Fred, but that wasn't a big issue there because he could push forward and close down Lindelof because Fred was marked out of the game by Granit Xhaka. The way the midfield battle was set was that it was Xhaka against Fred, we had Ozil against Matic, and Lucas Torreira against Lingard. However, when Arsenal did look to step forward in that manner, you would want someone on Maguire. So Mesut Ozil had to ensure that when he did step into the path of Maguire, he was blocking off the passing lane in towards Matic. But that was kind of how the game was. For the most part, those two did drop off a bit deeper from the center backs, and they were blocking off the passing lane into the midfielders, and that left the battle set in stone because you had David Luiz very tight on Martial, often fouling him when he did drop off a bit deeper. Sokratis could drop off to pick up Lingard if he did try to pull off a Torreira, but for the most part, the midfield battle was set, the wider players knew their roles, and Arsenal were organized once again, like we did see them against Chelsea, despite conceding much of the ball once Chelsea did change into more of a 4-3-3. United, on the other hand, was a bit different. They dropped off deeper, and they did have Martial having to cope with Sokratis and David Luiz pushing forward. In that situation, we saw both center backs often shift forward, and that was pivotal based off the fact that you do have David Luiz and Sokratis who could play balls out of the back, and we did see Luiz involved in some of the good moves that Arsenal did create from deeper positions. But the midfield battle was quite similar. Lingard sticking to Torreira, the Xhaka against Fred, and what we ended up seeing here was that there was a difference in the manner that United went about their business, and that was ultimately what led to their downfall. We had Ozil dropping off into that pocket of space that was pivotal against Chelsea when they were playing in a back three. Here, Nemanja Matic often dropped off to step into him to ensure that he was always applied with pressure when he received the ball. The key battle, however, was down the opposite side, where we did see Granit Xhaka, who was tasked to press Fred and vice versa, drop off into a deep left channel role just ahead of Kolasinac and David Luiz. Why did he do that? Well, what ended up happening there was that he knew Fred wouldn't step into that position to track him across the pitch, and then that leaves Daniel James in a very interesting predicament because we ended up having Aubameyang often dropping off ahead of Wan-Bissaka, and what he would end up doing there was creating a pathway for Kolasinac, who was more of a left wing back, to push forward. And what that does here is Aubameyang can dart in between Lindelof and in between Wan-Bissaka. He could dart into space behind Wan-Bissaka, but now that puts Daniel James in somewhat of a 1v2 because does he step to Xhaka to help out Fred? Does Fred shift over to close down the space for Kolasinac? And if he doesn't, how deep and how narrow does he position himself? That was the big talking point here because what ended up happening was Daniel James didn't really step to Granit Xhaka and he was caught narrow. Fred didn't step to Xhaka, and Xhaka now, who is a reliable ball-playing midfielder, was able to get on the ball, pick passes across the pitch, and it also allowed Kolasinac to push forward against Wan-Bissaka. What we can say though is that perhaps Solskjaer was willing to take that risk based on the fact that if Arsenal do lose the ball high, then you have Daniel James with so much space to break forward, and you would fancy Daniel James running against Kolasinac recovering, against Xhaka shifting over, or against David Luiz, who is renowned for making mistakes when attacked in 1v1 situations. So that perhaps was the risk that they took, but what ended up happening there was it pushed Arsenal into good positions, it allowed them to retain the ball for long spells, and it gave them an outlet to play out of the back that Manchester United didn't have because Arsenal were very organized and disciplined without the ball. However, when we do assess that game, it was a bit odd to see Arsenal go ahead earlier. We do know that it did stem down that left side, but when you look at how the game did start, United got into some good areas down that same flank on the counter-attack. When we look to the first example, what we end up seeing here is Wan-Bissaka being pressed by Aubameyang, and he pokes the ball into the path of Fred being tracked by Xhaka. So when Fred ends up getting onto the ball, he ends up dropping it back off to Wan-Bissaka, and that ignites Xhaka to step towards him. But what Wan-Bissaka is able to do is able to play the ball across Xhaka into the path of Daniel James, pulling out Kolasinac, and Daniel James instantly flicks the ball across Kolasinac into the path of Fred, running off Mesut Ozil. And what Fred is able to do now is he locates Lingard making a run off Lucas Torreira, and he plays the ball across Lucas Torreira into the path of Lingard, who is now free to run at the back four, and he slides the ball out to Rashford in a deeper position, but he can only curl his effort at Leno. Besides that, the only other time where Manchester United tested Leno in that first half was seconds ahead of halftime, where we had a Fred deliver a free kick to the far post that ended up seeing Harry Maguire not a tame effort from the 6-yard box at the Arsenal keeper. The other example that we do look at stems from Lindelof receiving the ball from Wan-Bissaka, and Lindelof ends up clearing his lines, but what Kolasinac ends up doing is he nods the ball into the path of Daniel James rather than Granit Xhaka, and Daniel James now plays the ball across Kolasinac into the path of Martial, who drags out Luiz and ends up being fouled, but before he's fouled, he flicks the ball across Kolasinac into the path of Daniel James, breaking down that right channel. And although Kolasinac does very well to make his recovering run across that pitch, he ends up taking out Daniel James and he ends up being booked. But in those two instances, we see how Arsenal were being bypassed, and that was a big worry for Mikel Arteta in those opening stages. Maitland-Niles conceding the ball near the halfway line doesn't help either, but Sokratis made a vital block to ensure that United couldn't break free. But when you look at those opening 5 to 7 minutes, you think that United are once again gonna hit another big side on the counterattack to claim all 3 points. However, Arsenal were dominant down that side as well, and United simply couldn't cope with it. We ended up seeing their opening goal stem down that left-hand side, and it was a great example as to how Arsenal were looking to exploit Daniel James's positioning, with Granit Xhaka dropping off a bit deeper and Kolasinac pushing forward at every given opportunity. So when we look to the build-up to the goal, initially we do see Ozil doing a great tracking job to ensure that Rashford can't combine with Luke Shaw. That eventually leads to Lacazette dropping off the ball into the path of Xhaka, but we do see Daniel James come across to try and win the 50-50 battle, and Daniel James does win the battle, but he ends up directing the ball off Lingard and ends up popping back into the path of Xhaka. So we have Daniel James out of position now, and we end up seeing Kolasinac pushing forward where Xhaka could play the pass to him for Kolasinac to push forward. So Kolasinac does push forward to run at Wan-Bissaka, and we end up seeing Aubameyang make that run in between Lindelof and Wan-Bissaka to receive the ball in that left channel. What we end up seeing there is Lindelof did shift over, but he ends up retreating his position. We end up seeing Aubameyang 1v1 against Wan-Bissaka, but no one ends up tracking the run of Kolasinac darting into that left half space on the underlap. What ends up happening here now is that Fred does drop off, And Lindelof does shift out Fred, try and instruct him to close down Kolasinac, but he doesn't, and Aubameyang just simply pokes the ball into the path of Kolasinac, and he ends up firing a low cross off Lindelof into the path of Nicolas Pepe, who doesn't make a mistake and puts Arsenal up 1-0. But we constantly saw different scenarios of Kolasinac breaking forward down that left-hand side, and it would be fitting to break them down just to show you the various manners in which Arsenal were getting forward in that opening period. We see Sokratis drop the ball off to Leno. We have Daniel James pushing out into the path of David Luiz, who is in the box, and we see Fred tracking Xhaka into his deeper role. But what Luiz is able to do now is able to clip the ball over Daniel James into the path of Kolasinac, and even though James is able to recover, Kolasinac pushes him off the ball and skips by Fred to run at Lindelof and Wan-Bissaka. He locates Aubameyang, making the run off Wan-Bissaka to a wider area, and Kolasinac slides the ball out into Aubameyang, who delivers a quality cross through the 6-yard box beyond the center backs, headed for Lacazette, but Shaw does a good job to get goal side and clear his lines. When we look to another example, this time we start with David Luiz pushing forward. We have Xhaka dropping off a bit deeper once again, but James nor Fred steps towards him. And we have Aubameyang ahead of Wan-Bissaka before he darts in between Wan-Bissaka and Lindelof to break towards goal. Luiz steps forward and he ends up again locating Kolasinac, breaking forward beyond Daniel James, and he ends up splitting Fred and James for Kolasinac to push forward, but his cross is blocked by Wan-Bissaka. Shortly after that, it is Maitland-Niles being pressed by Rashford, and he ends up poking the ball into the path of Ozil, dropping off ahead of Matic, and Ozil ends up squaring the ball to the other side of the pitch for Xhaka. Xhaka isn't pressed by Fred, and what we also end up seeing here is Lacazette dropping into space in between Fred and Daniel James. So a free Xhaka does locate Kolasinac, making another forward run down that left channel, and he ends up clipping the ball over James into the path of Kolasinac, and Kolasinac takes his touch across Wan-Bissaka, with Lacazette continuing his run into the path of the left channel, where Kolasinac combines with Lacazette, but once again his cross is blocked by Wan-Bissaka. Wan-Bissaka does deserve a lot of credit in that first half, because whenever Arsenal did break down that left-hand side, for the most part he did do a very good job of ensuring that balls didn't get played into the box. Shortly after that, we see Luiz stepping forward, this time being pressed by Lingard, and we also locate Lacazette dropping off a bit deeper to pull out Harry Maguire, which does leave a big gap in between Shaw and Lindelof. So we see Matic drop off into that space, and what we also end up seeing from Luiz is he wraps the ball across Lingard into the path of Mesut Ozil ahead of Matic, and he's able to take his touch across Rashford to slide the ball out to Nicolas Pepe ahead of Luke Shaw. With Pepe ahead of Luke Shaw, what he ends up doing is he pokes the ball across Shaw into the path of Lacazette, who darts into that right half space to hold up Maguire, and he does well to cut across Maguire, but he ends up poking his effort across goal, which isn't good for Lacazette given the fact that he got goal side of Maguire and should be testing David De Gea from there. We ended up seeing Lucas Torreira come close, firing a shot inches wide of the net, Nicolas Pepe hitting the post from a Manchester United mistake, which ended up seeing Lacazette force Lindelof into conceding possession. But when we look to the build up to the second goal, it stems through Xhaka once again, this time exploiting more issues with United's shape. We have Xhaka dropping off a bit deeper. Daniel James does step towards him, but what he ends up doing is he plays the ball out to Kolasinac, who is closed down by Wan-Bissaka at half. And what we see Kolasinac doing is that he instantly plays the ball back to Xhaka, who wraps the ball across Lingard into the path of Mesut Ozil, who is towards the right of Matic, who is caught out of position. What we end up seeing there is that Ozil ends up flicking the ball over Rashford, and Rashford was in that narrow position marked by Maitland-Niles, but once Ozil ends up getting on towards that ball, we end up seeing Maitland-Niles continue his run across Matic. What Ozil is allowed to do now is he's able to control the ball, turn, and Rashford doesn't step towards him. We end up seeing Luke Shaw being pulled up by Nicolas Pepe, who did drop off a bit deeper, and now that creates a gap in that right channel because Shaw's out of position, Rashford isn't stepping to Ozil, and we see Maitland-Niles running off Matic. The ball ends up being clipped over Matic into that right channel for Maitland-Niles to break free down it. And when Maitland-Niles picks up that ball, he ends up delivering a cross into the box that is cleared by Maguire. That first half was predominantly played down Arsenal's left side of the pitch. They struggled in the opening stages due to the fact that United were able to quickly break in transition. But as the game wore on, United couldn't cope with Xhaka or Kolasinac's movement, and they gave them too much time and space to push into attacking positions along with David Luiz. However, when we do look to that second half, we did see Arsenal drop off a bit more deeper into their two banks of four as United were forced to chase the game. Matic was more involved. We did see him in the first half play some nice penetrative passes around the midfield when he was able to bypass Ozil, and he did the same in that second half. He created one of United's better chances when we did see Andreas Pereira fire a shot into side netting. So Matic did play a key role in terms of giving United something different in midfield, and it did help, but it wasn't the decisive factor in this game. The other factor that we can look at is that we did see Lingard and eventually Andreas Pereira try to shift out into the path of Xhaka rather than Tyrrell, but that didn't really change Arsenal's discipline here, because what they were able to do is that they had Tyrrell step to Matic, and then they ended up seeing Ozil shift towards Fred. When you really look at it, United tried to change the game by bringing on Andreas Pereira and Greenwood. That didn't work out, and when you look at Arsenal's changes, a lot of it stemmed based off the fact of injuries, but Reece Nelson coming on for Pepe did show that they wanted more discipline down their right-hand side. When you do assess it, United never really tested Leno here, and they did try to shift their system as the match continued because Arsenal never really threatened them. What we ended up seeing here was eventually we had Rashford swapping with Martial, and Martial did offer some sort of a threat running at Maitland-Niles and Sokratis, and there was one play in particular where he was able to evade a few challenges, but once he got to the 6-yard box, just couldn't put the final touch on it, which does sum up United under Solskjaer. However, eventually they did move to a 4-4-2. We saw Saka come on for Kolasinac, who couldn't continue. Guendouzi ended up coming on for Lacazette, and what Arteta did here was he pushed Ozil up front, kept his shape, and only gave Ozil that role of closing down the center backs, which does make sense when you're trying to hold on to your lead, and it gave him the space to drop off a bit deeper and build attacks in transition. And then we saw Mata come on for Matic. He offers some creativity from central zones, especially when you're chasing a game, and he nearly created a chance for Rashford, but Leno did come off his line to clear danger. However, when you break down the game as a whole, it was won in the first half. Arsenal were dominant down that left-hand side. United had no answers for Kolasinac, Xhaka. They didn't look to stop Luiz, and frankly, when you do assess it, they could have prevented this result here. They didn't have the opportunities to break on the counterattack because the positioning of Xhaka did force their midfield out of position, and frankly, that was the decisive factor here, and that goes to show you that Mikel Arteta has the tactical flexibility to shift his approach and ensure that his team is able to get the result. And this was a much deserved first win for Arteta at Arsenal, and it leaves you with many questions to ask Solskjaer as United try to push for that final top 4 spot. But let me know what you guys think. Do Arsenal still have a chance of finishing the top 4? And what about Manchester United? Are they tired? Do they need more signings in January? Can they pull this off and push Chelsea to the limit? Meet me in the comments below. Don't forget I upload videos every day, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And once again, if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And that was your daily dose of the interviews.